Let's move on to our first speaker. First presentation is Asia's Drifting Records, Singing Asia Through the Eyes of Asia. And Professor Seo Kwang-deok, Professor of the Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences, Pukyoung National University, will present. Please welcome him. So, please. Good morning. My presentation, the title is Drifting Records of Asia and Singing Asia. And you've seen this video on our exhibition, and my presentation is really about the overview of the exhibition. And I will touch upon the other stuff that were not covered in the video. And as our moderator briefly mentioned, being drift, it's accident that happens on the sea. And after the 17th century, we started to see a lot of these seaborne accidents, and one reason for that is because we started to see a growing number of or volume of seaborne trade. More research might be needed on this, but when you look at the trade route in Asia between the 15th and the 16th centuries, and you can see Dongle near Busan city, and this picture shows how the trade were done around the city, and the trade routes were widely used for many maritime activities. However, with the leadership change in China after the 17th century, they banned the seaborne trade and other activities that were happening on the ocean, and they released or relaxed the ban. So at the government level, they banned this seaborne trade, and that stopped the trade at an official level. However, on the private sector, these exchanges and commercial activities still went on, and in particular with Japan and Jeju of Joseon, Taiwan, Ryukyu, and the Philippines were where we saw a lot of activities in terms of the seaborne trade. And these regions that I just mentioned, I will cover more about it later on, and these were where we saw a lot of the records on the drifting. So they went on the ship, and when you set for a sail, what is the destination or what is the purpose of having that? When they had this order or a ban on the seaborne activities or journey, then their purposes might have been for more private sector-driven purposes, not the official purposes like the diplomatic ties. And then when they came back, they had these wrecks or accidents on the sea. And although it is an accident, we could see these records. Because it's an accident, many people left these records or logs of what happened, and based on the records, we can assume what happened. And these drawings are the scroll of the seaborne journey or the drift to the Qing. And these records on drifting has two types. One is the official records. It describes what happened, and these are represented in the official documents or the history materials or the local records. And during the Joseon dynasty, we could see them in Chronicles of Three Kingdoms and Annals of Joseon Dynasty and all the other official records. And for the Qing dynasty, there's a chronology of Qing dynasty and addresses to the throne. And this is the Munjeong Byeoldan. The records on the Jeju returnees from drift, a part of the records of Border Defense Council. And this is from Qing dynasty, the addresses to the throne. So, as I briefly mentioned before, in terms of China, they don't have that many records on drifting, and for the reason we need to have more research. And when you look at these addresses to the throne, It's about the people who came to China, the drifters who came to China from the other countries. On the other hand, when you look at the private records about drifting, it's in forms of mythologies, tales, mysteries, essays, or drifting records. And for the Joseon dynasty, we can see them in the memorabilia of Three Kingdoms and collection of Eastern folk tales, and the Chang Hunter's records on drifting in the sea, and the other records which are already discovered in the records on drifting sea from Chebu or the others. They have similar names, and the Pyoherok, or the records on drifting in the sea, are the typical titles that we see. And for China, this is a very well-known storybook. Taiping Guangqi or the Yijianqi are the Chinese records on the drifting on the sea. So in terms of the records on drifting in the sea, there are official or the public and the private records. And what are the differences between the two? For the official and the public records are mostly about the description of how these drift accidents happened and how that were handled, and who were there, and what were the purpose of the journey, and when did it happen, and how the accident went. So that is for the public records, and when you try to make some modifications, then it will turn into the fiction or some other stories. So this is an example. As you saw in the video, Kim Dae-hwang, some person was drifting from the Jeju Island through Vietnam. He came back, and the daily log of drifting on sea was recorded in the Sukjong-shillok, or the annals of Sukjong the king, and we can see when you compare these to the records, you can see the differences. In terms of the private records, it's based on the person's drifting experience, their frustration, and how they overcame that challenge, and what they felt when they arrived in a whole new country or a foreign country. But the thing is that there might have been a lot of such drifting accidents, but we don't see many of the records, because it's a matter of who authors the private records. So although people had these drifting experiences, they were not able to create a story. There should be someone who can turn that into written stories. So I will cover more on this later, but there are some reasons why we don't see so many records, and who made it into written records or in what language are also key as we look into the records. And these are the list of the Korean records on the drifting on the sea, and there might be more to come. And as you have seen from the video, these are kind of the well-known the records of drifting, and many are being translated in our the Humanities Korea Plus is also working on this, and these are from Chinese. Pan Jung-gyu's Drift Log to the South, which talks about his journey from China to Vietnam, and Chung Kwang-deok's Drifting Records in Foreign Seas from China to Japan, and Chae Jung-lan's Records on Southern Sea from Taiwan to Vietnam. And one typical characteristic of Chinese records is that they have very few private records written on the drifting in the sea, and I'll cover more on this about why is that. And this is about Japan, because it's an island, and we see rather more records on drifting, and Ito Lannin's records, and what you see on the left is the Diary of Drifting in Chosun, and that's been translated. And I think Professor Park, who will present later, will also translate the other records. And this is about the Vietnam Truong Dang Kis Not Bon Kien Van Luc, which is about the records on their journey to Japan. And as you can see here, it's in Chinese. So the characters are the Chinese characters were commonly used for these records because we were sharing this Chinese culture. And next, but the problem is when they had this wreckage and they had this drifting accident, they might die. And however, they safely came back, and that's how we can see the records of drifting. And also, the other thing that's of interest is that the place or the country where these drifters arrived sent them back to their own home country. And in terms of Chinese people, in Korea, when they came to Korea as a drifter, then depending on what they want, we send them back by sea or by land. And when they arrived in the western coast, then we send them back to the Uiju, the city. And depending on their place of origin, we send them to Beijing or to other cities. And for the Japanese drifters, we had investigation in Tsushima Prefecture, and depending on their addresses, we send them back to Japan. And in China, many drifters happen to arrive, and when they arrive in the coastal waters, then the officials of the provincial governments send some officials, and they do the investigation, and they provide some clothing and food, and they report it back to the main country. And when they arrive when Ryukyu people arrive in China, then they send them to Fuzhou, or from like the East Asian people arrive in China, then they send them back to Xiamen or Guangzhou, or they are from Vietnam, they send them to Guangdong or Guangxi or the other cities. If they are Chosun people or from Korea, then they send them back to Fangcheng or Uiju. So by country, I compared how they treat the drifters, and this is about the repatriation. When they arrive in Banju, then they send them to Songgyong or Apno River and Uiju. And when Japanese arrive in China, then at the time, the Qing dynasty and Japan didn't have any diplomatic ties, so all the handover were handled by the merchants of China. And when you read Kim Dae-wang's records on drift to Vietnam, in their journey from Vietnam to Jeju, they were on the ship of the merchants. And the Chosun, well, you can use the land road to arrive Chosun, but Japan was not really where you can access through the land road. And the repatriation caused by the Chinese and the Netherlands trade, the repatriation for that purpose was approved or allowed by the feudal government. So this whole repatriation process and the handover process were really depending on the diplomatic ties between the countries. And for Japan, they had 4 different channels: Tsushima, Matsumae, Nagasaki, and Satsuma. And for Korea, Tsushima, and for China and the Netherlands, Nagasaki were the connecting point, and that was how Japan repatriated the drifters. And for Japan, during the Tokugawa feudal government, when they arrived, they sent them to Nagasaki and Tsushima for repatriation. And when they arrived in Ejochi, maybe the next presenter will cover on this, then about this case. And when they arrive in Ejochi, then they have to go through Edo. And this whole process of repatriation were fully in place in 1630. And all the foreign ships that came to or entered into Japan used the Nagasaki port, and Chosun drifters or their ships were not an exception. So that was how they repatriated the drifting people or the ships. So as we are doing this study on Busan Port City or the Nagasaki, when you learn more about it, even before the modern times, they had very close ties in terms of this trade. However, we need to look into the further historic materials. So there are some limitations to prove that, but that's what we see now. And in terms of the Chinese drifters, compared to Joseon, it was a very strict in terms of the process, and some drifters were not allowed to enter the port. And so these Chinese drifters, their repatriation was handled at the port of Nagasaki, and they sent them all to the port of Nagasaki, and they had to go to their home country at their own expenses or with their own means. And when they arrived in Nagasaki, then the official center handling foreign affairs managed the process. So when you look at the process, you can learn more about how these three countries were having their diplomatic relations. Now, I have a few slides before we close. So up until now, I touched upon the materials that were already available. So now I want to talk about the East Asian perspective on the records of the drifting. As my title indicates, this requires more research, but it can be an interesting question. So after the 17th century, we saw a huge increase in terms of the records in drifting. Of course, I don't mean that it was a huge, like a soaring number, but compared to the previous years, there was an increase. And Japan's a leading ocean researcher, Hamashita Takeshi, also mentioned that from Joseon, they had this like a large trade network, and Joseon was, not a big part of it. There's not much records that can support that. And he asked the question, and we started to focus on these records of the drifting, and we have more such records than the other countries. So the people who left for the sea, who were they and why they were taking this journey? And when we can find the answer, I think one reason might be because of the commercial trade. Some people say that these records might be fake because they had this ban on the official trade, on the seaborne trade. So they just faking and pretend that they were having this drifting accident. So that will explain why we started to see more records of drifting showed up in or after 17th century. It could be just one, not all, the explanation. And as you can see on the map, these are the winds and the currents, and they didn't have any motor or engines for the ship, so they had to follow these winds and the currents. And in the East Asia, these were the directions or the movements of the winds and the currents, and they had to stop or arrive where these winds and currents led them. And also, as I briefly mentioned before, we were sharing this culture of the Chinese characters. We had these Chinese characters, and when we looked into how many days they stayed and when they send them back, and along the way they are happen to have this cultural or other exchanges between different cultural circles. And in Vietnam's case, their records were also in Chinese, although they didn't speak Chinese. In terms of the written language, they share this Chinese character as a culture circle. And I believe the value of the records of drifting is immense because it's about the culture or literature, maybe not about the history, but in terms of the literature, arts or the works, they have a very good expressions and of very high literature values. So it would mean a lot. And in terms of the historic values, of course, it will carry out a very strong and high significance, because so these records on drifting may have values in terms of history and the literature as well. And also they are a very good cultural contents. They can be used for like the comic content or for children's books, and they can be a good materials for education. And there are many documentaries based on these records on drifting. So it can be a very good and rich source of cultural contents. So we are now looking into the Asia through the eyes of Asia. Then we can have better mutual understanding of the Asian countries, because based on these records of the drifting and comparing them, we can have a better understanding of the culture and history of East Asia and understand each other's culture and also reconstruct the historical status. So that's it for my presentation. Thank you.